You're listening to Ideas and Leaders podcast. I'm Elena Paweta, Executive Communication Coach and TEDx organizer. With each episode, I'll share with you communication tips and ideas from top business leaders to help you excel in your career. Hello. Welcome to the next episode of Ideas and Leaders podcast. Today, I'm speaking with David Jones. He's a founder and CEO of the Talent Enterprise. It is a leading think and do tank focused on the elevation of human capital. And today we're going to speak about human capital, about attracting talent, and many other interesting topics. Hi, David. It's great to have you on Ideas and Leaders.
Hi, Elena. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
So, David, I know that you are working with business owners, you're working with organizations, and that your company, the Talent Enterprise, is doing a lot of interesting things. So can you tell us a little bit about your methodology, which is very interesting, what it's all about, and how did you start it in the first place?
Okay, thank you. So the Talent Enterprise is 10 years old this year. And myself and there's two other co-founders of the company. We started the company really with a vision to help to make labour markets more efficient. I think those people who know about labour markets in particular would say that whether they're internal or external labour markets, so promoting people internally or hiring people from outside your organisation, it's typically considered to be an inefficient labour market in the sense that you often don't have a lot of objective information about people's capabilities. People who are applying for jobs don't often have a lot of objective information about what is required, and it needs a lot of reading between the lines. And so what we have done at the Talent Enterprise is we've created some very innovative assessment technology and methodologies which help to give insights into people's preferences, their strengths, and also their capabilities. And through a process of self-awareness and feedback, we help our clients to select better candidates who are more likely to stay for longer and have higher levels of productivity. And it also helps individuals, whether they're going through the education process and going through career guidance or selecting what their majors would be in their studies. It helps them to make better decisions so that they can have a more enjoyable, again, more productive experience in their working lives as well.
Oh, so it is more like psychological tests, or I know that you also have the AI involved. So how does it look like?
Yeah, so we run a lot of psychometric assessments. So we have a technology platform called Lighthouse, which hosts all of the psychometric assessments that we have, and we can curate the user experience during this process. We try not to make the assessment seem too much like an exam. We try to make it more of a sort of self-discovery process, and we're very open with the feedback on the results. Because we believe that, again, information is very important and self-awareness is very important to improve the efficiency of labour markets for everybody involved. And the system is very much like a combination of Netflix and a YouTube for assessments. So just like when you log on to Netflix, you would have this sort of card structure. You can then have various different elements of the relevant assessments being undertaken. We try not to make it too formal or too onerous. So each assessment can typically be 2 or 3 minutes long. It's very virtual or simulations or game-based, gamified assessments. Some cases we use virtual reality as well, so that you can navigate this whole process fairly quickly. And then the YouTube part comes from our clients. So we're a B2B company, so typically our clients are employers, then creating their own organization-specific We call them SJTs, or situational judgment tests. So these are like mini case studies, so real work-life situations that the individual can get to try and to see how they would deal with certain situations. So this approach together helps to simulate what the actual working experience could be, and it helps people to make better decisions in this increasingly hot war for talent that we have at the moment in many places in the world.
Yeah. So do you think that in the future, people interviewing other people will not be needed anymore, and discussing those case studies, that everything will go online, or still this human element is important?
I think that we are still human beings, and I think at the end, when it comes to like the final shortlist of 3 candidates or the final decision making, then I don't think anybody would want to take a job that they don't understand that they have the chance to meet the person, if not face to face, then at least screen to screen in a live situation like this, to be able to make that decision. Because I think, you know, we've had millions of years of evolution as human beings, and whilst a lot of these tools can make the selection process more efficient, so we can very quickly go from very large numbers of candidates. So sometimes we start off, particularly with graduate recruitment campaigns for some of our global clients, we can have, you know, more than 100,000 applicants in the first few days. We can get it down to a very objectively selected shortlist very quickly. So the technology can really help with that. The AI that you mentioned often comes in with doing things like veracity checking, or doing things like online proctoring. So we can do risk assessments to check people's identity, or to check that they're not at risk of cheating if they have other software open on their laptop, or if there's somebody else in the room, or if their gaze is in the sort of wrong direction. All of this can give us a risk assessment, which helps to make these decisions. But yes, I think at the end of the day, we're still human beings.
Yeah, but still it will make our life much easier, right? Because now we have one interview, second interview, third interview. Many people are involved in this process, and there is also risk of, you know, being biased, maybe because of
Sure.
many
Yes.
different
Yeah,
things.
absolutely.
And do you think that also this this software and this method that you're providing, it allows people to be less biased, and maybe to have more equality, let's say, in the workplace?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So I think, you know, if you're making selection decisions and you're restricting your comparative group, maybe to, you know, whoever's in the organization today, right? And then you look around the organization, and particularly at the top of the organization, many of the top leaders are often male, pale, and stale, right? They're not very representative of society in general, or often the customer base of the organization. Then this puts an inherent bias into the comparative group. So one of the services that we provide at the Talent Enterprise is we now have, I think we've had more than 1.5 million people complete our assessments in the 10 years that we've been in operation. And this gives us a very large database to be able to make sure that we can give a very broad and representative sample. We can do different cuts for different regions of the world. We can look at different industries. We can try and be aspirational in many ways, so try and increase representation in some ways, and we can use our data to do that. But we have to be very careful and very objective and very transparent about how we're comparing somebody's individual results with a standard or a benchmark.
Yeah, I think that this is the future of this industry, because otherwise, especially for big corporations, it is getting too hard in the beginning to to manage all this process.
Yes.
So
Yes,
I definitely think that it's good. But what would you recommend for companies that, let's say, that still are hiring their people, looking for their people, old school way, without the online tests, without the software and AI? So what do you think is the key? What is the most important in looking for the top talent? What would you say is the most important that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, so I think if we use statistics, or if we use algorithms to help us to measure the effectiveness of the selection decisions, then of course what we mentioned before about making sure that we're not baking in bias into that process is important. But what it can do is it can also help us to identify what are our most productive sources of talent, or talent pool. So if, as an organization, for the last 20, 30 years, you've always recruited graduates on your fast track management program from certain universities, that could be absolutely fine. But maybe you want to compare one university to another university. Maybe you want to try a broader range of universities which you can access online. So you could access any university career service, or any candidate globally using technology today. You don't have to restrict yourself to a certain talent pool. You can often then compare and track over time, okay, what was the attrition risk of somebody joining from a certain talent source? What was their level of productivity, performance? What was their rate of career progression? And you can track this over time. So it's often very interesting, because sometimes the findings can be surprising for our clients. There are lots of, I guess, reputations of certain institutions, or reputations of certain agencies who are used to source talent. But often alternative or innovative sources can be much more productive.
Yeah. And what do you think, how this market changed after COVID pandemic? Do you see any particular changes? How can we adjust to those changes?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what we're seeing is that generally in most industries across the world, and we tend to operate mostly in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, we're finding very, very tight labor markets. So I think that's from a number of factors. I think some people dropped out of the labor market during the pandemic, and some of them haven't come back yet. I think also we're seeing certain jobs and certain industries being very, very hot for finding talent, particularly in technology. I think we're also seeing some roles, particularly some of the sort of traditional corporate functions. So this could be like the more accounting, procurement, legal, HR types of functions. These are, I think, having an oversupply of people who are qualified as professionals in those areas. But now the traditional career paths are being eroded because there's greater and greater automation. Overall, I think there's two big trends that are coming from the pandemic specifically. One is, I think, that there's a big impact of well-being, workplace well-being, on how employees are attracted, and also how they are retained inside organizations. So I think things like the environmental reputation, things like the focus on physical, mental health, things like making sure that if you're working remotely, or if you have some sort of hybrid type of working environment, that you're still able to connect with the culture and the colleagues that you have available to you. This is becoming more important, and particularly for young people who joined organizations during this period. I think they have quite a lot of challenges because older people, more established workers were able to maintain their relationships online, either with their colleagues, their clients, or their customers. But I think new workers have reported in our research to be much more isolated and to feel like they're not able to start or have these sort of moments of truth in cementing the relationship. So I think well-being is becoming much more important. I think at the same time, what we're seeing is that there is a bigger focus on a more rounded sort of recognition approach. So again, particularly amongst young people, we're finding that there's a change in people's motivation for working. It used to be thought, and in the sort of psychometric assessments that are more traditional, you often find a lot of questions about people's motivation, which are making this distinction between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, right? So extrinsic is more about the sort of financial reward and recognition, and intrinsic is more about this sort of sense of purpose and meaning and identity that you get from your work. And it used to be thought that these were two quite separate sources of motivation, and for each person, one was dominant, right? Whichever one. What we find now is for more and more people, again, particularly stronger for younger people and for women returning to the workplace, for these demographics in particular, then what we're seeing is that this distinction is breaking down. And now we have this more ambitrinsic motivation where people are saying, look, I want to work for a company that makes me feel good because it's doing something which I think is related to my values and ethics. It reinforces my sense of identity. It gives me a sense of purpose and meaning. But at the same time, I also expect to be very well rewarded and recognized at the same time. So the sort of sacrifice that maybe older generations were willing to make, or that more men are willing to make, that, okay, I will do this thing because I'm going to be paid very well, but I don't really like it in the core of my being, in my philosophy, but I'm willing to sacrifice that, is becoming less and less of a common trade-off as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think that because of this change, it might be harder for corporations to find talent, to attract talent, because there are less people who are willing to do the job just because of money.
No,
they need this well-being in the organization. They need to see this work-life balance. For example, I can see even among my friends and my students that when they choose between a company that has the flexible working hours right now and company that says, okay, you have to be 3 days a week in the office, they would choose definitely the flexible working hours so that they can travel, they can work from home whenever they want. And so do you think that there is a way how companies can cope with this challenge right now?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that occur to me from what you said. I think one thing that's really interesting, right? Again, I think over the last 2.5 years, I think when you talk about work-life balance and you talk about flexibility, I think the whole landscape has changed for many people. Okay, of course, not everybody has the opportunity to work for a company with this flexible approach. Sometimes people, have to be physically present to do their job, or it's very much on a shift work type of situation. But many people have had this, and I think actually the source of stress in many people's jobs is not how it was, say, 3 years ago. It used to be, okay, how do I protect my time at home with my friends and my family from all the demands in the workplace? Okay, that was the challenge, right? Like, I have to commute to work, I have to work 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day, and I have to look after my kids, or I have to look after my elderly relatives, and I want to see my friends. This was the challenge. Okay, it's interesting for those people now who are working remotely and more flexibly. It suits many people, of course, right? And there's lots of benefits from it, but there's also a dark side to it as well, right? The dark side is, okay, is my home situation set up for me to be productive? Is it going to enhance my well-being, or is it a different source of stress, right? So now it's more about, okay, how do I carve out a certain amount of time in my day if I'm working from home, and maybe my partner is working from home, right? Maybe my kids are working from home at the same time, right? So how do I protect a certain place for me to feel positive and productive about my job, and make sure I have that identity along with all these other challenges that I have, right? So that's a really interesting change that we've seen over that time period. And I think another answer to your question, which I think is a big focus now, is I think progressive employers are now focusing a lot more on what we call their employer brand. Okay, just as much as they have traditionally focused on their product or their service brand, right? So making sure that they are managing and enhancing the employee experience, making sure that there's a consistency between the philosophy that they say in their marketplace and the philosophy that they have internally, and that sort of consistency and congruence is becoming more and more important. And I think, just as you know, it's just the first thing that anybody does, right? If you're an employer and you have a candidate who's been shortlisted, you'll Google that person, right? Or you'll search for them on all the major social media challenges and see what type of person they are, right? And candidates will do the same, right? They'll go on to Glassdoor, or they'll go on to other similar sorts of platforms, and they'll say, right, you know, what do people say, like really say, confidentially about the experience of working for this organization? So that sort of due diligence and that sort of cascading of the employer brand is becoming more and more important.
Yes, there's an employer brand and also personal brand of of candidates. Those are very important things right now, as we cannot be totally anonymous, and everything is online now. So it is really interesting how many changes are now in the labor market over the last couple of years, how many things are completely changing. So it is really interesting to discuss those things. And David, I wanted to ask you also about one thing, from the perspective of an entrepreneur, because
Yes.
You said that you are managing the talent enterprise for 10 years, right?
Yes.
So because many entrepreneurs and people who want to become entrepreneurs are listening to our podcast. So what are your main lessons learned, and what would you recommend to entrepreneurs and especially beginners out there? What are the most important things that we need to focus on, and maybe what are the things that we shouldn't worry about?
Okay. Well, I can only talk about my experience, but I think there's a couple of things that I have learned over the last 10 years. I think, first of all, you know, the people that you work with, particularly at the very beginning, where you're forming your enterprise, is really crucial, right? So if you have co-founders or even some of your first clients, this is really, really important, that you have the right sorts of partnerships. Many people start businesses by themselves, but being an entrepreneur is tough, right? So if you are by yourself as a sort of sole proprietor, then you need to make sure that the support network that you have around you, whether from a business perspective or a personal perspective, understands the challenges and the opportunities that means, and is supportive, right? So you have a really strong team around you. I think also you need to have self-awareness, and you need to make sure that you're really cut out to be an entrepreneur and not a wantrepreneur, right? That it's not just, you know, like a cool and trendy thing to do, but it's actually something which you think is suited to your preferences and capabilities. So a lot of the assessments that we do at the Talent Enterprise, we have profiles for entrepreneurship as well, and particularly things like grit, resilience, growth mindset, these sorts of psychometric properties or character strengths, comfort with ambiguity, openness to new experience, a sort of greater risk profile. All of these aspects are really important, okay, for you to really challenge yourself and say, okay, is this something that I is this a journey that I think is exciting and inspiring for me? And then the final thing I think for entrepreneurs particularly is the well-being for an entrepreneur is also really important. Often, again, we talked a lot about branding in the discussion so far. Often, again, particularly at the beginning of your journey, you as an individual are the brand for your organization. So you have to make sure that you're able to sustain your performance and your positivity and productivity in a way that's meaningful for you. Okay, so there's a great deal, in my experience, there's a great deal of excitement and a great deal of motivation, but you have to make sure that there's something else that you can do that is going to give you that sense of perspective and that sense of having the opportunity to reflect on what you're doing, because just as we're talking about earlier with people who are working for other people's organizations, this can become very consuming if it's your organization and it's your identity and it's your passion that you're involved in. So you have to keep that sense of perspective. That could be friends, family, hobbies, other interests, whatever it might be. There has to be something that gives you this sort of more rounded sort of lifestyle that's not just 120% dedicated to your business.
Yeah, thank you very much for those wise words. I know that many entrepreneurs, they listen to this narrative that we need to hustle 24/7, and then after some time we're just getting burned out and we don't want to continue anymore. So this is all about being going step by step, but also taking care about ourselves as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think like some of the moments of truth that I'm thinking about now in the last 10 years, I think often it's where you say no, right? Where you get an opportunity to do something and you think either that's not in the sort of area of expertise that we're trying to develop, or it's not something that I feel comfortable with, or I'm not sure I'm going to be the person, or we're going to be the organization to do the best job, and you say no. Because especially as you said, in the early days, you'll say, okay, yeah, we can do that, we can create a solution for you, right? We can hustle and work hard, and we can do that. At some point, I think when you get to that first stage where you say, okay, actually we have the confidence to say no, that sort of reaffirms your identity as an organization, and it should give you that confidence to be able to then take it to the next level. So it's not just about saying yes to everything or finding a solution to everything. It's also about being very, very clear about, okay, what is your brand, what is your expertise, and that's defined often by the things that you don't do as well as by the things that you do.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, David, for all of your tips and your experience and sharing your experience with us. I know that your new book is coming up soon, The Future of Assessments. So let's recommend our listeners definitely to read this book. And if we want to find you in the internet, where can we find you? What is your webpage?
Yes, so our company webpage is thetalententerprise.com, or you can find me on David Jones on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to field any questions or any sort of follow-up discussion that might come from our discussion today.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for this interview, David.
Thank you, Elena. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Ideas and Leaders podcast. Did you enjoy this episode? Let me know that you listened by tagging me in your LinkedIn profile and using a hashtag Ideas and Leaders. See you in the next episode.